Welcome to Women of Culture. I'm Meera T. Sundararajan. Join me and my distinguished guests to discover untold stories from the world of culture. If you've ever been to a New Year's Eve party, picture the scene for a moment. There was probably a countdown as midnight approached, maybe some sputtering fireworks or champagne. Perhaps, as the clock struck 12, there was even a fond kiss or two. And after the great moment was over, someone, somewhere, may have started to sing that song, Auld Lang Syne, a simultaneous lament for the old year and pleasantly melancholic welcome of the new. If you've ever heard it at a New Year's event or elsewhere, wondered at the colorful words of dialect, and tried to piece together what it all means, perhaps through a fog of champagne or in the aftermath of a midnight indiscretion, then you know the work of Robert Burns. He wrote the words back in 1788, more than 200 years ago, in the Scottish dialect that he elevated to the art of poetry and popularized far beyond Scottish shores. What makes a poem last more than 2 centuries? What makes it so popular that it's almost impossible not to know it, even if only in fragments of words and feelings? It's a mystery, the mysterious power of the art of poetry, which has been with us since we first became human and will probably be with us until the end. Robert Burns was a master practitioner, and if you're curious to know more about the mystery of who poets are and what they do, this interview with Hector MacQueen is a must-listen. It turns out that poets can be tough to categorize. As Hector tells it, Burns was an improbable figure, a man from a simple background as a farmer who became a poet, in the process exploring and shaping the lilting Scots tongue to his purpose. He was also a passionate, impulsive man, famed for his love affairs. And one of those love affairs was with Clarinda, the woman who was, as Hector puts it, the love of his life. No matter that she was already married, though estranged from her husband. Still, in deference to the social mores of the day, they adopted pen names in the letters that they wrote to one another. She was Clarinda, he Sylvander. But after Burns' death, the public had a growing appetite to know more. His biographers obligingly went digging, and Burns' private, passionate, inevitably scandalous letters to Clarinda ended up in court. Was it help or hindrance that among the judges hearing the matter was Clarinda's own uncle? Hector MacQueen, Scottish historian, lawyer, and extraordinary storyteller in his own right, tells the story of his own passion for poetry, of Burns' passion for Clarinda, and of what ultimately happened when the story of a poet's private passion unfolded in the broad light of day before the Scottish courts of law at the dawn of the 19th century. But the story isn't over. Far from it. For Burns' passion for Clarinda lives on in our time, immortalized in Burns' poem, A Fond Kiss, well known to lovers of Scottish music worldwide, featured here in a beautiful version by Karen Matheson with Paul Brady. The public, it turns out, is still hungry to know. Though Burns and Clarinda are gone, their passion still lives on, transmuted by time into a universal story of love, longing, and profound nostalgia. It's a story that Hector tells in truly inimitable style.
A fond kiss and we sever, a farewell that lasts forever. Deep in her drum tears I'll pledge thee, warring sighs and groans I'll wage thee.
Hector MacQueen, thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed for the podcast today. And to introduce you as a law professor from Edinburgh would be like introducing Robert Burns as a writer from Scotland. So I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to ask you to say a few words about yourself and your career as a legal scholar extraordinaire as well as a historian.
Well, it's kind of you to say extraordinaire. I don't think of it that way myself. But yes, I've been a teacher at Edinburgh Law School since 1978 and have sort of climbed the academic ladder there and became a professor in 1994. And retired in September 2021, so that I'm now Emeritus Professor of Private Law at Edinburgh and enjoying my retirement accordingly.
I'm just laughing as you're saying that because you speak of your retirement, but you are by far the busiest and most active retired person that I have ever met in my life so far, and possibly ever will meet.
Well,
But
again, it's kind of you to say so. I've known quite a few busy retired professors in my time, so my aspiration has always been to be retired, and then I could get on with the things that really interested me in the way that they did. And so,
absolutely, absolutely, and of course, in addition to your work as a professor and a legal scholar, you've been a Scottish Law Commissioner.
yes, that was an interesting and enjoyable time in my life from 2009 to 2018. And one could say one definitely had some impact on the law. There are two acts on the Scottish statute book and a couple on the UK statute book, which are down to my time and my contribution. So, yes, for once in my life, I felt something had been achieved that was of real practical significance.
Always a challenge or a hope, I guess, for those of us who are active in the academic scenario. We always hope that there is a practical impact for the theories that we're researching and developing. And
Yeah,
undoubtedly, in
yeah,
your career,
yeah.
that's very obvious to all who have been following what's happening. So,
Right.
and of course, in addition to being a scholar who has written on law, then you are a wonderful historian. And this is a part of your background that I'm not very familiar with. So I'm very curious to hear how you became interested in history. Was this something that preceded your involvement in law or emerged as a result of it, or somehow came to you in an altogether different way? How did you become interested in
Yes.
history?
Well, I can't remember a time when I wasn't interested in
Hmm.
history. Um, I mean, in part, it was my upbringing because my parents were both historically minded. My father was a professor of English literature and of Scottish studies in Edinburgh, and my mother was a classicist, and
Mm.
they were both very engaged by history. So it was almost a sort of part of breathing when I was growing up that we were doing historical things or talking about historical things at home. And
Mm.
so I definitely grew up with that around. I also went to a fairly historical school in
Mm.
Edinburgh. In fact, my father told me that he chose the school from the various competing schools in Edinburgh, and there are a lot of them, because it
Hmm.
was so historical. And,
Mm.
that has had a big impact on my life one way and another. The building in particular is a 17th century quadrangular building, and
Mm.
it's in some ways it's absolutely useless for 20th century education. But in lots of ways, it gave you an ambience of
Mm.
historic events, historic things. And it looked across to Edinburgh Castle. It's just opposite Edinburgh
Oh,
Castle. So the
spectacular.
whole atmosphere was historical. It was not exactly one that one necessarily fully appreciated at the time, but it was definitely part of my upbringing and the framing of the mental world and the interests that you have as a result of it.
How fascinating. And the pictures that you're conjuring of Edinburgh and the castle, are just so engrossing. It's such a rich environment,
Yeah.
to begin with, and then for you to have this family background where you were living a life steeped in history in a sense because of your parents' work. That just sounds like a very propitious beginning for a career in history.
Yes.
And
My brothers would deny it, of course. So neither of them
oh,
has
well,
followed in this line, but
neither of them was infected by the historical bug in the way
no,
that you were.
no, not really. Although my younger brother has become interested in family history and so on,
Mm.
but it's a late development in his life. My other
Oh,
brother was an artist
oh my.
who. Well, he still is an artist. So let's not beat about the bush. But uh, history hasn't featured large in his career thus far, anyway. So,
Hmm. But on the other hand, as I'm listening to you speak, I can see how the various influences, both from your sibling side and from your parents' side, seem to have played into your own development in such an interesting way. Because you are a lawyer, a historian, and also you have a very obvious interest in writing and in literature that I have seen over the years. And
mhm,
I was going to ask you what role literature has played in your life and work, and you've already begun to answer that question by speaking about your father.
mhm, mhm, mhm. But I think the thing at home was there were always books. The house was full of
Mm,
books,
mm.
and reading was not discouraged. Uh, and
Wonderful. Mm.
perhaps the most significant thing in a way was the writings of C.S. Lewis,
Oh,
who had
of
taught my
course.
father at Cambridge, and
Oh.
J.R.R. Tolkien. So there was this sort of, fantasy, but fantasy that was rooted somehow in historical realities that was quite infectious. And I really did lap all that up. I also had a godmother who was a classicist, first at St Andrews and later at Oxford, Nan Dunbar, and she was quite a close friend of C.S. Lewis. And so every
Oh
year
my.
from my first year on, she gave me the Chronicles of Narnia one by one, and I still have them. And my father's copy of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and so on and so forth. So there was a sort of definitely medieval
Mm,
flavor, if you like, to the reading that I did when I was about. I should also confess straight
mm.
away that I read Tarzan of the Apes. So, uh, I had a huge collection when I was a boy of Tarzan
Oh yeah.
novels. So I must be careful not to give a misleading impression of a boy absorbed in medieval studies. But I suppose a certain degree of fantasy worlds that were very different from the worlds I actually lived in day by day was quite important. So
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I was smiling with pleasure when you mentioned C.S. Lewis and Tolkien because, of course, I grew up reading those authors as well. I think many people have, and
yeah.
with the recent films of the Lord of the Rings and so on, if anything, that's only expanded an awareness of of Tolkien's work, but
Yeah.
it's quite something to be personally connected with such authors. So that is a unique angle that you're bringing into the discussion today, for sure.
Well,
Yeah.
I must be careful not to claim too much. I never met either of them, but uh, the connection was there with my parents, and particularly my godmother. In a way, that was part of the story. The other thing that was perhaps relevant from my godmother was that when she went to Oxford, she quickly fell in or out with Hugh Trevor Roper, the great Oxford historian of the 50s, 60s, and so on. And she was
Mm.
very cross with his views on Scottish history and wrote to him
Oh.
indignant letters about what he was saying in print about Scotland. And there was a great crossing of swords and clash. And when my godmother came to Edinburgh for a visit or whatever, she would
Mm.
cheerfully tell us about her latest clashes with the man she called Troper.
I
And
see.
yeah, so it all engaged me in a sort of
Yeah.
slightly distant way, but it was very entertaining. And subsequently I have read works by Trevor Roper as well, and
Mm.
I can see why my aunt got indignant, but at the same time he wrote beautifully. So perhaps that was why my aunt got so cross.
Mm. Absolutely. Hector, I'm conscious that I'm speaking to you on International Women's Day, and I'm very struck in your narrative by the role played by powerful and prominent women scholars,
Mm.
your mother and godmother, and so on. And how does this happen? It does seem a bit unusual for the times that these women would have been able to carry out work at such a level and then pass on this legacy to you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it is curious because it was only very recently, within the last 15 years, that I realized that my mother and my godmother, who were very close friends from school days on, um,
Mm.
uh, had gone to Cambridge and been amongst the very first women graduates. I mean, I think their year was maybe the second
Mm.
or third year to actually be able to graduate from Cambridge.
Mm.
And
Extraordinary.
yeah, they had never said anything about this to me, and in part that may be because
Mm.
there had been university teaching for women at Cambridge since the late 19th century, but the
Mm.
graduation was not allowed for women. It seems extraordinary. You can go
Mm.
through all the
Yeah.
courses and pass all the exams and be stars, as both my mother and godmother were, but you're not allowed to graduate
Mm.
until just before they went. I mean, I think it was an effect of the Second World War. I may be wrong on that, but this is in the late 40s, early 50s. And they were amongst that sort of very early generation. And of course, they both got,
Mm.
double firsts and all that sort of thing. So uh, quite
Yeah.
clearly capable of matching anything that the men could throw at them. But I think my mother didn't
Mm.
particularly like Girton College. And, she was not a sort of extrovert sort of person, but she it was always kind of reluctant, I think, anyway, to talk about Girton. But I mean, maybe it's worth my mentioning that at Girton, she and my godmother were, so to speak, adopted
Mm.
by Lily Attia. That's right.
Okay.
And Lily Attia was her married name, and I think she was Lily Brown, if I remember correctly. Um, uh, she was a mathematician. She'd been a star mathematician at Edinburgh during the war. And she'd gone on to do further study at Cambridge, and she kind of adopted my mother and my godmother, as she became, on their arrival, because they were fellow Scots.
Mhm.
And weirdly, that sort of ran on in terms of family links right through until the last few years, because I became very friendly with her husband, Michael Atiyah. Um, uh, Michael Atiyah, as you may know, was a very, very distinguished mathematician, outstanding mathematician, and also the
Yes.
brother of the legal scholar Patrick Atiyah, whom I admired from a
Oh.
distance but never actually met. But Michael and I were
Mm.
very close for especially the last few years of his life. And that was entirely
Mm.
down to the contact between his wife, Lily, and my mother and godmother. And I knew them all by reputation before finally Michael and Lily moved to Edinburgh in
Mm.
the 1990s. So there was a sort of tie-in of this Cambridge world, which was quite significant for me. Not only when I was growing up, but in later and very recent life as well.
Hmm, what a remarkable legacy, and how interesting that parts of it have unfolded over time. I wonder if this is, one of the characteristics of very accomplished women is that they tend to be also, well, it's not good to generalize, but at the same time, in my experience as well, they tend to be quite modest and humble about their achievements. And
Yeah, yeah,
eh, yes, so things tend to emerge gradually over time,
yes,
and I've
yes,
seen that
no, absolutely,
in my own
yeah,
family as well. So yes.
yeah, yeah. No, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I think my mother would never have wanted the limelight in any sort of sense. She was quite shy and modest and so on. She just preferred to
Mm,
work away at her own thing, which was essentially the classics. But yeah, I think she was pretty capable.
absolutely, that's quite evident. Well, I had wanted to speak to you today about a specific subject as well, in which you have done some very interesting work. A court case, actually, that took place more than 200 years ago, so very appropriate for your expertise and interests, both as a lawyer and historian, and in fact, as a person connected with literature as well. And that case involves a rather prominent and important Scottish poet, Robert Burns.
Yes.
uh, and can I ask you, before we actually get into the discussion of the case itself, I'm just always curious, and to you, the answer to this question is probably very obvious, but Robert Burns lived now more than 200 years ago. And so I'm always curious about how that legacy, the legacy of a writer like that, lives on in the present. And what
Mm,
does Robert Burns mean to you as a Scotsman today?
yes. Well, he is the national bard,
Mm,
as we say. So I think it'd be a very unusual Scottish person who didn't at least have some acquaintance with Burns and with at least some of his work. I mean, probably the famous example is Auld Lang Syne.
yes,
Um,
of course.
but I think most people have a little bit more knowledge than that. The again,
Mm,
another of the things I remember from my youth is that because of the school I went to and the position that I had in that school, I was asked at the age of 17 to go to a Burns supper. And
mm,
I mean, Burns suppers had been traditionally male affairs. But for a long time, there had been this ladies' club in Edinburgh called the Clarinda Ladies' Club, and we'll get to Clarinda in due course. But it consisted
okay.
entirely of women, and they too wished to celebrate the life and the career and the poetry of Burns. But in the traditional Burns supper, there was a what's called a toast to the lassies, i.e., to the women, because Burns famously was a womanizer, and I think he would have failed many of our politically correct tests today in regard to his attitude towards women. But obviously the Ladies Burns Club couldn't possibly have a toast to the lasses, so it needed a toast to the laddies. And they got a laddie in to do the toast to the laddies and also the address to the haggis. And one of the most daunting experiences of my life was to stand up in an almost from an all boys school, perhaps I should add, and give these addresses and toasts to an almost entirely female group, most of whom were at least twice or three times my age and more. But I still have the book they presented me with at the end, which is a tartan covered work of the complete works of Burns. And I've found that invaluable over the last 50 years. But
Goodness.
Burns is a deep part of Scottish culture, and I think pretty
Mm,
well everyone who has been in Scotland for any length of time, and that's not just native-born Scots, would
mm,
recognise the images of Burns. There are a few from his lifetime. There's a silhouette, there's a full-face portrait, and so on, and they would know instantly this is Burns,
mm,
and be able to probably quote at least a couple of lines from things like
mm.
Auld Lang Syne and one or two others.
May I ask you to explain, just for the benefit of listeners who may not be aware, what is meant by an address to the haggis?
Right. Well, the starting point is that Burns wrote a poem about the haggis, the Scottish
Mm,
dish called the haggis, which is a fascinating mixture of things, which is presented initially. It's prepared. It's a collection of waste material, really awful,
mm.
OFFAL, awful, from various deceased animals, sewn up in the stomach of the sheep from which probably most of the offal came. And at Burns suppers, this is brought to the table in its bag. And the address to the haggis is a key opening stage of the Burns supper,
Mm,
uh, during which the how shall I put it? The person burdened with making the address recites Burns' poem, and at the
mm,
crucial lines where Burns says that he'll cut open this desirable dish, this famous Scottish dish, the speaker is required to tear open with a knife the stomach bag and let the contents spill out on the plate, and that is then
mm,
served to the gathering that's
mm.
awaiting. So I was expected to do that at the age of 17, which, as I say, in front of an all-female audience was a very daunting
Yes,
experience, but one
yes,
that, as you can probably tell, I look back on with great pleasure now. I
yes,
did it.
yes. After the fact, perhaps an early success in your professional career. Absolutely.
Well,
It does, it does sound like a very dramatic ceremonial moment where you were
it
able to
was. Yes, yes,
fulfill
yes.
this role, yes. And obviously, they must have been quite happy with you to present you with such a valuable book and so on.
Yeah, yeah. No, it
Um,
was lovely. Yeah,
yes, sounds sounds like it.
yes.
It's very, very interesting, Hector. And can we turn then to the case? So the
Yes.
facts behind this case, they're so interesting.
Yes, well, the story is that Burns first published his poetry in what's known today as the Kilmarnock edition because it appeared in near his home. His home was in Ayrshire, and Kilmarnock is probably the second town of Ayrshire. So it was published in Kilmarnock, and it was known as a Kilmarnock edition. And it was an overnight sensation. The point being that Burns came from a very rural background, in the usual phrase, the ploughman poet. And some of his poetry reflected that experience of Scottish agriculture at the time, which was going through a phase of development. It was moving from the medieval to the semi-modern, at least, and Burns was part of that. But here was, this heaven-born genius who had suddenly emerged from the midst of the Scottish people, and could produce what really was actually pretty amazing poetry that
Yeah.
caught somehow the popular moods in the mid 1780s. So he came to Edinburgh, to be feted as the man of the hour, as it were, but also to raise money so that he could publish more of his work and do more of his work. Because one of the things that he did was that he was a collector. He wasn't just writing from his own sort of inspiration and experience. He was using the ballads of the countryside and building upon them new and interesting work. So he was a collector, and he was seeking to raise the funds to enable him to carry on with that work, as opposed to going back to being a ploughman. So he was in Edinburgh, and as I say, he was a bit of a social lion. And it's one event that was held from Edinburgh. He met this lady, Agnes Maclehose, or Nancy, as she was usually known, who was exactly the same age as him, and obviously Burns found her very attractive. But the problem with Agnes Maclehose, or the problem for Agnes Maclehose, was that she was a married woman already. But she had left her husband 5 years before, despite having two or I think three children, and fled him. They'd lived in Glasgow, and she fled to Edinburgh to escape his drunken attentions, shall we say, what was fairly obviously an intolerable situation. But that, of course, in itself was scandalous in the sort of late-ish 18th century, leaving your husband and so on.
Yeah.
And being a single woman, how did you live? There could only be one way. Now, as it happens, she was actually financially supported by a judge of the Court of Session, which is the main Scottish court, William Craig. So she was, in fact, shall we say, legitimate um, uh, in those terms. But she really had to make it seem as if she was a good girl. And so she was very religious, she was very literary, and so on. And she was obviously also very attractive to Burns, not only in the straightforward sense, but because she was interested in literature and so on.
Absolutely.
So they started an affair fairly shortly after that initial meeting, but an affair that was conducted in dead secret, because it would be disastrous for Agnes or Nancy if it was known that she was seeing a man who was possibly married to already. But even so, even if he wasn't married, it would be a bad thing for her to be seen associating with such notorious libertine as Burns. So they corresponded a lot, and they corresponded anonymously, with Burns calling himself Sylvander, which means the wild woodsman, i.e., the rural figure, and Clarinda. Clarinda was, a sort of shepherdess figure, the epitome of rural female innocence. Um, uh, so being courted by this rough figure. And the point I think about them using these names, dear Clarinda, dear Sylvander, in their correspondence, was if anyone intercepted the letters, they couldn't possibly know who was actually sending them. And the correspondence was fairly, shall we say, frank. And although I don't think anything untoward ever happened between them, there was, shall we say, a degree of intimacy that took place
Mm.
in Nancy's house, Clarinda's house, and it was shaming for such things to be publicly known. Now, the correspondence remained entirely between the two during the lifetime of Burns. He died in 1796, aged 37. But Clarinda was still alive. And the Burns mania really began after Burns' death. There was a huge, huge turnout at his funeral. It was a bit like
Mm.
Diana, Princess Diana in the late
Mm.
90s here in the
Yeah.
UK.
Mm-hmm.
People were obviously deeply moved by this sort of youthful death of their
Mm-hmm.
star poet, this ordinary
Yes.
man of the people, and so on.
Mm.
Um, and really, things just cascaded on from that funeral with publications
Mm.
of Burns' poetry, his works, and crucially, his correspondence. But not
Mm.
initially, at any rate, including the correspondence with Clorinda, because all obviously
Mm-hmm.
uh, Nancy had all the letters, and she wasn't for showing them to anyone. Um,
Mm.
but by the end of the 18th century, Clorinda needed money. She was,
Mm. Mm.
struggling somewhat, and she began to show
Mm.
people these letters and to tell her side of the story.
Mm.
And
Mm.
unfortunately for her, one of the people to whom she showed the letters went ahead and published them in a little
Mm.
book, pocket size book in Edinburgh, and claimed, the person
Mm.
who published them claimed that did so with the permission of the lady to whom the letters had been addressed.
Mm.
Um, Now, she didn't bring an action because obviously this was still a matter of, shall we say, social shame,
Yes.
social degradation,
Mm.
and so on. But so it's a fascinating question how the action came
Mm.
to be raised. And an
Mm.
equally fascinating question is the fact that amongst the judges before whom this action was raised was William Craig, the man who had, as it were, given her refuge in Edinburgh
Yeah.
nearly 20 years before.
Mm.
So the court also had an interest in keeping
Mm.
the full story secret. And the way
Mm.
the action was brought initially was by Burns' publishers, who had the
Okay.
copyright, as we would call it
Mm.
today, the literary property rights,
Yeah.
because Burns' works were all registered at Stationers' Hall in
Mm.
London, and Cadell and Davis were the publishers whose names were also registered. But the key
Mm.
point about these letters to Clorinda was that they had never been published. Cadell and Davis had not had access to them. They could not
Mm.
claim any copyright. So the action
Mm.
which they brought initially was one that seemed to have no chance whatever of success. What rights did publishers have in unpublished letters
Mm.
of a poet to his paramour
Mm.
nearly 20 years before?
Mm.
Um, and what that seemed to leave was the possibility that the person who had published these letters was absolutely free to do so. Um,
Mm.
and so,
Mm.
what counsel for the Burns interests, so to speak, did was to bring into the action members of Burns' family.
Mm.
And Burns' family was crucial in all this because much of the activity around Burns in the immediate aftermath of his death was associated with finding funds to, as it were, protect the family. The legend, and I think there's a fair degree of truth in it, was that the family had been left absolutely impoverished by Burns' death. Um,
Right.
uh,
Not
and
unusual. Hmm.
yeah, there was a public interest, if you like, in ensuring that
Mm.
this family, a wife,
Mm.
Jean Armour, her name was, another famous
Mm.
name in
Mhm.
Scottish history, and their
Mhm.
children would
Mm.
be provided for, would not be in want.
Mm.
Um, so the master stroke in the litigation was to bring the family in as parties, um, because what
Mm.
was then possible to argue was that Burns was entitled to privacy for his uh, writings, his love
Mm.
letters. Probably also was the person to whom the letters were addressed, but that wasn't the key point. The key point was
Mm.
Burns had produced these letters not for publication, but for the eyes of his friend only, and that
Mm.
interest that he had in keeping that private could only be protected, given that he was dead, by his family.
Mm.
And that action was ultimately successful. And what's
Mm.
interesting is they were associated with the publishers, but the court, in giving its decision, said the expenses, as we say in Scotland, or the costs,
Mm.
as might be
Yeah.
said in um, common law litigation,
Mm.
should be awarded not to the publishers, not to Cadell and Davies, but to Burns' family. And
Mm.
that makes it absolutely clear that it was the bringing in of the family, the intervention of the family, that was key to the success of this action.
Mm. And so, was there a reputational element to all of this, ultimately on Burns's side as well? Then, but
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, would you like
I
to?
think there definitely was, and
Mm.
Burns, had expressed himself in passionate terms,
Mm.
uh, and
We would expect no less.
yes, yes, but it's also very interesting to see the ways in which the arguments in the case and the decisions of the judges are presented. It's an
Mm.
absolute outrage that a man's private and personal feelings should be exposed in this way. And there's
Mm.
even a reference, particularly in the judgment of Lord Craig, who never disclosed his interest in the case.
Mm.
In essence, what he's talking about is trash can journalism, and
Mm.
you know, the news of
Mm.
the world is no longer with us. But
Yeah.
clearly, Lord Craig would have had little difficulty in
Mm.
telling them to go where they should be. And so,
Yeah, and
yeah,
speaking of Princess Diana, so it's a tradition that goes a long way
yeah, yeah.
back.
And when I wrote my article in this case, the issues about privacy in English law and indeed in Scots law were
Mm.
very much to the fore. It was only 10 years after the death of Diana, and it still wasn't
Mm.
completely clear that English law in particular recognized the right to privacy. So at least part
Mm.
of when I wrote about the case was to suggest that actually, yes, Scots law has recognized a right to privacy for 200 years, and we don't need to
Mm.
follow the English law in this matter.
So when the judges spoke then about the privacy interest and Burns's reputation or honor, I guess you could say, because it was his not only his writings but his sort of personal feelings, presumably as a national figure and so on, that needed to be kept intact and sacrosanct at a certain level. So how did they describe that reputational interest? And maybe I can explain my question a little bit because that interests me, among other things, because the family was brought in, and so he was in this situation where he was involved with someone else whom he eventually married and had a family, had children with that person. but at the same time, his character, as you say, as a man of the world, shall we say, with many uh, perhaps interests beyond his committed spouse as well, that was well known. So, was that something that was seen as disreputable in Scottish society of the time, or what exactly was the nature of the reputational interest that was of concern here?
Yes, yes. No, it's a nice question. Um, I think the point really was that no one should be exposed in this particular manner. I mean, I think the thing that was well recognized about letters, and there were English cases to this effect as
Mm,
well, that you
mhm,
sent your letters to another person and you said whatever it was you wanted to say to that person. And what the word premeditated appears
mm,
in the language. You are simply giving expression to your unpremeditated feelings. This is what you
mm,
felt and thought. And you were not trying to hide anything, if you like, or disguise what your feelings were. Um, and that
mm,
seems to be pretty important to the courts, not only in Scotland, but also in England.
mm.
Famous case like Pope against Curl, where
Yes.
the letters of Alexander Pope were involved. So that was well understood, but the problem was how to fit that into your legal systems. With the starting
Mm,
idea in many, including England and Scotland, was that somehow or other the writer of a letter retained a right of property, not literary property, because it was reasonably
mm,
clear that literary property only applied to published material, that you had a right
mm,
of property which was somehow linked to the physical manuscript.
mm,
And that meant that the recipient did not have an unfettered right of property in that manuscript and its contents either. And that was
mm,
how I think English law proceeded, but it was, shall we say, conceptually a bit unclear.
mm,
Whereas I think in
mm,
Scots law, partly with our Roman law tradition, we had
mm,
what's known as actio injuriarum.
mhm,
And the essence of that was that insult was actionable. And the publication of a person's correspondence was an insult, without
mm,
that person's permission, was an insult
mm,
to that person. And of course, what was
mm,
interesting was that there had developed in the course of the 18th century a practice of publishing letters. It was seen that
mm,
letters were indeed very revealing of a person's character.
mm,
Um, but you should always edit and temper what it was that you published, and you should always get the consent of the person who had written the letter. So there was a practice.
mm.
Biographies are the classic instance. Johnson, the biography of Johnson
Yeah.
by Boswell, for example, and
Mm,
even before the Clarinda letters were published, a lot of Burns' letters
mm,
had been published in a four-volume biography
mm,
that appeared at the end of the 18th century.
mm,
And no doubt the huge success of that biography was part of what prompted the publication or the
mm,
attempted publication of these otherwise unpublished and unknown
mm,
letters to
mm,
Clarinda.
mm,
So I think there was a perception at the time that the right thing to do was to get permission and to edit
mm.
so that
Yeah.
anything that might be unseemly or reflect badly on the person whose letters you were publishing was kept from the public gaze. And I think that
Mm,
attitude continued really through the 19th century. And even when it wasn't
mm.
letters, if it was unpublished memoirs, for example,
Oh, yes.
um, if they were to be published, then they had to be expurgated as well. Essentially, what you were doing in publishing the letters or the memoirs or whatever it was of the individual was you were putting that individual on a pedestal. And this was an example to the rest of the world. And you shouldn't put anything in that would detract from that pedestal or suggest that the person in question had feet of clay. Whereas, of course, today we really look for the exposure of the feet of clay.
Which is maybe
So
more a
that
reflection on. I'm sorry, I was going to say, which is maybe more a reflection on ourselves than on the people whose
possibly,
feet are being
yes, we are
examined.
certainly a more nosy and intrusive. But that's not, that part of the point of the modern world is to say, actually, people shouldn't be allowed to convey false images of themselves. The public is entitled to know the truth. And I think myself, there's quite a lot to be said
Yeah.
for that view.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fortune grieves him while the star of hope she leaves him. Mean a cheerful twinkle lights me, dark despair round benights me. I'll ne'er blame my partial fancy, nothing could resist my Nancy, but to see her was to love her, love but her